Mark Reynolds was the kind of man people envied. Tall, confident, and always dressed in tailored suits, he exuded success. His real estate empire had turned him into a millionaire before 40, and his name carried weight in the business world. He had a sprawling estate in an exclusive neighborhood, luxury cars parked in the driveway, and a reputation that commanded respect. But what truly made his life seem perfect was his wife, Julia. Julia was elegant, intelligent, and devoted to their family. She had once been the center of Mark's world, the woman who stood by him when he was just starting his career. They had 2 children, both attending prestigious schools, and their social circle was filled with the city's elite. To everyone who knew them, they were the picture of a successful and happy family. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind the grand facade, Mark and Julia's marriage had been deteriorating for years. The passion that once fueled their relationship had long faded, replaced by polite conversations and forced smiles at social events. Mark spent more time at work than at home, and when he was home, he was distant. Julia, once patient and understanding, had grown tired of his absence. She had tried to revive their relationship, but her efforts had been met with indifference. The distance between them widened as Mark became more focused on his business. Late nights at the office became routine, and weekend getaways turned into solo trips for Julia and the kids. Mark justified his absence as a necessity, a sacrifice for their future, but deep down, he knew the truth. He no longer saw Julia as the woman he had once fallen in love with. And then there was Rachel Carter. Rachel had started working as Mark's assistant 2 years earlier. She was young, ambitious, and undeniably attractive. Unlike Julia, who had grown weary of Mark's excuses, Rachel hung on to his every word. She admired him, laughed at his jokes, and made him feel like the powerful, desirable man he believed himself to be. At first, their relationship was professional, but the lines blurred quickly. A lingering glance turned into late-night conversations, which led to private meetings behind closed doors. Before long, they were entangled in a passionate affair. Mark convinced himself that he wasn't doing anything wrong. His marriage was already broken, he told himself, and Rachel was simply filling a void. But Julia wasn't blind. She noticed the subtle changes, how Mark guarded his phone, how he suddenly cared about his appearance more than usual, how he always seemed preoccupied. The excuses about work began to sound rehearsed, and the distance between them became impossible to ignore. She didn't have proof, but she had a feeling that something was very, very wrong. And soon she would find out the truth. Julia had always trusted her instincts, and now they were screaming at her that something was wrong. Mark had been acting strangely for months, coming home late, avoiding eye contact, and keeping his phone glued to his hand. At first, she dismissed it as stress from work, but the signs became too obvious to ignore. The sudden business trips, the way he smiled at his phone when he thought she wasn't looking, the scent of unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, it all pointed to one thing. He was hiding something. She told herself she was imagining things, that after years of marriage, paranoia had crept in. But when she reached for his phone one night while he was in the shower, her worst fears were confirmed. His screen lit up with a message from Rachel Carter, his assistant. The words were flirtatious, too intimate to be mistaken for a simple work conversation. Julia's heart pounded as she scrolled through the messages. There were dozens, stretching back for months. Love notes, secret rendezvous, and promises of a future together. They spoke of late-night meetings in hotels, of stolen moments at the office when no one was around. It wasn't just an affair. Mark was emotionally invested in this woman. Rage and betrayal crashed over her, but she knew she had to be careful. If she confronted him without solid proof, he would lie, gaslight her into believing she was overreacting. She needed evidence, something he couldn't deny. She hired a private investigator the next morning. It felt surreal taking such a step, but she had no choice. Within weeks, she had everything she needed. Photographs of Mark and Rachel entering a hotel, call logs proving late-night conversations, and even receipts from expensive gifts he had purchased for her. Julia sat in her car, gripping the file tightly, her hands shaking. There was no more doubt. That evening, she didn't mention what she had discovered. Instead, she acted as though nothing had changed, all while planning her next move. The betrayal burned inside her, but she would not let emotions control her. A week later, she filed for divorce. When Mark received the papers, he was stunned. He hadn't seen it coming. Julia had played the role of the oblivious wife so well that he never suspected she knew the truth. He tried to reason with her, to talk his way out of it, but Julia had already made up her mind. She wanted half of everything: his money, his properties, his investments. And she wanted full custody of their children. Mark panicked. If the affair became public, it could ruin his career and his reputation. Rachel, too, felt the pressure. She had imagined a future with Mark, but now everything was falling apart. The more desperate they became, the more dangerous the situation grew. And then Julia was murdered. Julia Reynolds was found dead in her home on a quiet, stormy night. The crime scene was brutal. She had been strangled, her body left sprawled on the floor of the living room. There were signs of a struggle, overturned furniture, and shattered glass. But strangely, nothing had been stolen. Her jewelry, cash, and valuables remained untouched, ruling out a robbery gone wrong. Whoever had done this hadn't come for money. They had come for her. The discovery sent shockwaves through the city. Julia was well known in her social circles, and news of her murder spread quickly. The media latched onto the case, speculating on possible suspects. Whispers of her recent divorce filing and her husband's well-publicized affair made the story even more scandalous. The police immediately focused their attention on the two people with the most to gain from her death: Mark Reynolds and Rachel Carter. Mark was the obvious suspect. The bitter divorce battle, the affair, and the financial consequences of losing half his wealth painted him as a man with motive. But Mark had an alibi. That night he had been at a business conference in another city, surrounded by colleagues and security footage that placed him miles away at the time of the murder. He seemed untouchable. That left Rachel. Rachel had no alibi for the night of Julia's death. Her phone records placed her near Julia's house just hours before the estimated time of the murder. Security cameras in the neighborhood had mysteriously stopped working that evening, but a witness reported seeing a car matching Rachel's parked a few streets away. Investigators also uncovered suspicious online searches on Rachel's laptop, ways to disable security cameras, methods of strangulation, and how to erase digital footprints. The pressure on her mounted quickly. The media painted her as the jealous mistress, the woman who wanted Julia out of the picture so she could have Mark all to herself. But Rachel denied everything. She insisted she had nothing to do with the murder, that she had only been in the area that night by coincidence. Her story, however, was weak. As detectives dug deeper, more chilling details emerged. Julia had called a friend just days before her murder, saying she felt like she was being followed. She had also reported strange incidents: her car tires slashed, eerie phone calls where no one spoke on the other end, and once, a shadowy figure standing outside her house late at night. She had feared for her life, but no one had taken it seriously. Now, with Julia dead, all eyes were on Rachel. The police believed they had their prime suspect. It seemed like an open and shut case. But there was one detail they hadn't considered. Something far more sinister was at play. Rachel wasn't the only one with a secret, and the truth was about to take a devastating turn. Rachel Carter became the face of the investigation almost overnight. The media swarmed her apartment, flashing cameras and shouting accusations as she tried to maintain her innocence. The police had already pieced together a compelling case against her. She had no alibi, her phone placed her near the crime scene, and her online searches hinted at premeditation. The narrative was clear. A jealous mistress, driven by rage and desperation, had eliminated the woman standing in her way. Detectives combed through Rachel's past, searching for any sign of instability. They found that she had been involved in an altercation with a previous employer, an argument that had turned physical. Though no charges were filed, it painted a picture of a woman with a temper. More damning was the discovery of a deleted email draft found on her computer. an unsent message to Mark in which she begged him to leave Julia once and for all. Investigators saw it as proof of motive. Despite the mounting pressure, Rachel refused to confess. She maintained that she had no reason to kill Julia and that her presence near the Reynolds home that night was purely coincidence. But as the prosecution built its case, Rachel realized she was running out of time. The world had already decided she was guilty. Then, something unexpected happened. A forensic analyst reviewing Julia's phone records made a startling discovery. On the day of her murder, Julia had received multiple calls from an unknown number. The number was traced to a burner phone purchased 2 weeks prior. Surveillance footage from the store showed a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses buying the phone with cash. His face was obscured, but his build and posture looked eerily familiar. The breakthrough led investigators back to Mark Reynolds. Though he had a strong alibi, the new evidence suggested that he had played a role in his wife's death. As detectives re-examined the case, they uncovered something even more chilling: a hidden storage unit rented under a false name. Inside, they found Julia's missing jewelry, her broken phone, and, most damning of all, a pair of gloves with traces of her blood. The gloves contained DNA that didn't belong to Rachel. It belonged to a man with a criminal record, a known hitman who had disappeared shortly after Julia's murder. The pieces finally clicked into place. Mark hadn't needed an alibi because he had never planned to kill Julia himself. He had hired someone to do it for him, making sure the evidence pointed directly at Rachel. When confronted, Mark denied everything at first. But with the forensic evidence stacked against him, his carefully constructed lies began to crumble. He had orchestrated the perfect crime, setting up Rachel as the scapegoat while he walked away unscathed. He had nearly gotten away with it. Rachel, once the prime suspect, was no longer the focus of the case. The truth had finally surfaced, but the damage had already been done. Mark Reynolds had built his life on control. Every decision, every business deal, every relationship was carefully calculated. His success was not accidental. It was a product of strategy, manipulation, and the ability to stay 3 steps ahead of everyone else. When his marriage to Julia began to crumble, he saw it not as a personal failure, but as a problem that needed to be solved. The affair with Rachel had been easy. It gave him the excitement his marriage lacked. But when Julia discovered the truth and demanded a divorce, she became an obstacle, and obstacles, in Mark's world, were meant to be eliminated. Rachel had been the perfect scapegoat. She was young, ambitious, and hopelessly in love with him. He knew that with a little effort he could make her look guilty. He planted seeds of doubt in conversations, making it seem like she was obsessed with him, hinting that she was emotionally unstable. He had even encouraged her to send desperate messages, knowing they would be used against her later. Every step had been meticulously planned. When Julia was finally murdered, he felt a wave of relief. It was done. The problem had been solved. For a while, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The police focused on Rachel almost immediately. The evidence against her was compelling: her internet searches, her presence near Julia's home, the history of her affair with Mark. He watched as the investigation unfolded, confident that she would take the fall. He even played the role of the grieving husband, making emotional statements to the media about how much he loved Julia and how devastated he was by her death. It was almost too easy. But then the case took an unexpected turn. A forensic analyst reviewing Julia's phone records noticed something odd: several calls from an untraceable number in the days leading up to her murder. The number was connected to a burner phone purchased in cash 2 weeks prior. Investigators pulled security footage from the store where the phone had been bought. The man's face was partially hidden by a baseball cap and sunglasses, but his build was familiar. The new lead led detectives to re-examine the case. Mark's alibi had seemed airtight. He had been at a business conference in another city at the time of the murder, with security footage and multiple witnesses backing his claim. But the new evidence suggested that he had orchestrated everything from afar. When they searched a storage unit rented under a false name, they found chilling evidence: a pair of gloves with Julia's blood, her missing jewelry, and her shattered phone. Even more damning, the DNA on the gloves matched a known hitman who had disappeared shortly after the murder. The hitman had been paid through an offshore account linked to one of Mark's shell companies. The murders had happened elsewhere. It all made sense now. Mark had never needed to be present at the crime scene. He had paid someone else to do his dirty work, ensuring that Rachel would take the blame. When confronted with the evidence, Mark's confidence began to waver. He denied everything at first, claiming it was a setup, that someone was trying to frame him. But the prosecution had built an ironclad case, the money trail, the burner phone, the storage unit. It was undeniable. In a shocking courtroom revelation, Mark finally broke down. He admitted to hiring the killer, but he tried to justify his actions. He claimed that Julia was going to ruin him, that she was taking everything he had worked for, that he had no other choice. But there was no justification for what he had done. He had coldly planned the murder of his wife, a woman who had once been the love of his life, all because he refused to lose control. Rachel, who had spent months as the prime suspect, was cleared of all charges, but the damage had already been done. She had been humiliated, abandoned, and branded as a murderer before the truth was revealed. Even though she walked free, her life was forever changed. The woman who had once been full of ambition and hope now carried the scars of a crime she had never committed. Mark was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His fortune was seized, his reputation was destroyed, and his empire crumbled. The man who had spent his life controlling everything now had no power at all. His name became infamous, a reminder of how power, greed, and arrogance could turn even the most successful man into a monster. But the most chilling part of the case was how close Mark had come to getting away with it. If just one piece of evidence had remained hidden, if one investigator had missed a single clue, Rachel would have been convicted, and Mark would have walked free. It was a terrifying reminder that sometimes justice depended on the smallest details. The city moved on, but those closest to the case never did. Julia's children were left with a father behind bars and the memory of a mother taken too soon. Rachel left the city, hoping to start over, but the whispers followed her wherever she went. And Mark sat alone in his cell, replaying every move he had made, knowing that if just one thing had gone differently, he would have been a free man. It was a case that people would talk about for years, a reminder that behind the most perfect lives, the darkest secrets often lurk, and that sometimes the person you trust the most is the one you should fear. The trial was over. Mark Reynolds, once a powerful businessman with a seemingly perfect life, had been sentenced to life in prison for orchestrating the murder of his wife, Julia. The courtroom had been packed for the final verdict, reporters eager to capture the moment a man who had controlled everything for so long finally lost control. The judge's words were final, unshakable. There would be no parole, no second chances. Mark was led away in handcuffs, his face void of emotion, but for those who knew him, the mask of composure was just another performance. Outside, the world had already moved on to the next headline, but for those directly impacted, there was no moving on. The trial might have ended, but the consequences of Mark's actions stretched far beyond the courtroom. Rachel Carter was free, but her life had been shattered. The months of being labeled a murderer had taken their toll. She had lost her job, her home, and her reputation. Friends had abandoned her, unwilling to be associated with the woman once thought to have brutally killed her lover's wife. Even with her name cleared, suspicion lingered. People still whispered, still cast sideways glances as she walked past. She had loved Mark, believed his promises, sacrificed years of her life for him, only to discover that she had never meant anything to him at all. She had been nothing more than a pawn, a disposable piece in his carefully constructed game. The realization haunted her. How had she not seen what he was capable of? How had she not known she was just another tool in his pursuit of control? Later, Rachel packed what little she had left and left the city, hoping to start over somewhere far away. But starting over wasn't easy when the past refused to let go. The internet was forever, and so was her association with Mark Reynolds. No matter where she went, she would always be the woman he had used and nearly destroyed. For Julia's family, the verdict brought justice but no relief. She was gone, and nothing could change that. Her children had lost their mother in the most violent way possible, and the man responsible was the one who was supposed to protect them. The truth about their father would follow them for the rest of their lives, a painful legacy they never asked for. The city, once captivated by the scandal, slowly forgot. Mark's empire crumbled, his name became a warning rather than a symbol of success, and people moved on. But in the quiet spaces, where the cameras had long stopped flashing, the real damage remained. In his prison cell, Mark Reynolds sat alone, no longer a businessman, no longer a man of power. He had controlled everything, his marriage, his career, his relationships, and yet, in the end, he had lost it all. The world he had carefully built had collapsed around him, brick by brick, leaving him with nothing but the weight of his own choices. He had almost won. He had come so close to framing Rachel, to walking away untouched, to living the life he had envisioned. If not for a single mistake, a single overlooked detail, he would have been free. The thought tormented him more than the prison walls ever could. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, always staying ahead, always knowing how to manipulate the outcome. But in the end, he had been outplayed by the very thing he never accounted for: human error. For everyone else, life continued. New scandals took over the news, new crimes captured the public's attention, and the case of Mark Reynolds faded into the archives of true crime history. But those who had lived through it, who had suffered its consequences, knew that some stories never truly end. They linger, whispering in the background, reminding the world that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who wear the perfect disguise.